She was just a housemaid with a painful past. He was a wealthy widower too blinded by pride to see the truth. When Caleb Whitmore forced Hannah out of his estate, he thought it was justice. But he never imagined the hole she'd leave behind her. The truth his daughter would reveal. From quiet heartbreak to a second chance in a Portland marketplace, this is the story of a love nearly lost, and the promise that brought them home. Moonlight spilling through a nursery window like spilled milk, casting shadows that dance and whisper secrets. And there, curled up on that cold hardwood floor, was Hannah Sullivan, 22 years old with eyes that held more sorrow than a woman twice her age should know. Her arms were wrapped tight around little Sophie Whitmore, both of them breathing soft and steady, lost in dreams that were probably kinder than their waking hours. Now most rich men would have fired a nanny for sleeping on the floor with their child. Hell, most would have called it improper, unseemly. But Caleb Whitmore wasn't most men, though he spent most of his life pretending to be. When he found them like that, something stirred in his chest, something he'd buried deeper than his wife's grave. Hannah Sullivan knew hunger like an old friend, not just the annoying ache in your belly when there ain't enough food to go around, but the deeper hunger, the kind that lives in your chest and whispers that you ain't worth feeding in the first place. She knew the taste of watered-down soup and day-old bread, the feel of clothes that had been worn by a dozen girls before her, the sound of footsteps in the hallway that never stopped at her door. She'd spent 18 long years at St. Mary's. Home for girls, a gray brick building that squatted on Portland's east side like a toad on a lily pad. All narrow windows and peeling paint. The kind of place society builds to house its unwanted children and then tries real hard to forget about. Sister Agnes, bless her weathered soul and tired hands, had done her best with what little they had. She was a woman who could stretch $1 till it screamed and make 47 girls feel loved with nothing but stories and prayers and the occasional contraband candy bar hidden in her habit. But there's only so much love you can stretch when you're feeding 47 girls with the budget for 20. And Hannah learned early that she was one of the ones who'd have to make do with less. No one adopts a girl your age, Hannah. Sister. Agnes had told her on her 18th birthday, her voice soft as worn velvet, but heavy with truth. You're invisible to them now. Too old to be cute. Too young to be useful. Hannah had nodded, said she understood. But inside her chest something cracked, not broke. Girls like Hannah don't break easy, but cracked, like ice on a pond in early spring. She'd packed her few belongings in a carpetbag older than she was and walked into the world with $47 and a heart full of hope she didn't dare name. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 12 acres of manicured perfection, the kind of place where every blade of grass knew its place, and every flower bloomed according to schedule. Rolling lawns stretched out like green seas, dotted with ancient oaks that had been standing when the first Whitmore set foot on American soil. Rose gardens wound through the property in careful patterns, their blooms arranged by color and season, with the precision of a master painter's palette. The house itself was a monument to everything money could buy. 3 stories of Georgian brick with windows that caught the morning sun and threw it back like golden coins, columns that wouldn't have been out of place at a Roman temple, and gardens that whispered of old money and older secrets. It was the kind of place that made visitors speak in hushed tones, as if they were walking through a cathedral instead of a home. But for all its beauty, for all its grandeur, the Whitmore estate was missing something essential. It was missing the sound of laughter, the warmth of genuine joy, the feeling that comes when a house becomes something more than just walls and windows and perfectly arranged furniture. Caleb had built his fortune in shipping, starting with his grandfather's 2-boat operation that barely kept food on the table, and turning it into an empire that spanned 3 oceans and employed thousands of souls. He was the kind of man who could read a profit and loss statement like poetry, who could smell a good deal from 3 states away, who could turn a handshake into $1 million contract. At 41, He had salt and pepper hair that caught the light just so, eyes the color of storm clouds rolling in over the ocean, and the kind of presence that made boardrooms full of powerful men sit up and take notice. He wore his wealth like armor, expensive suits tailored to perfection, watches that cost more than most folks made in a year, cars that purred like contented cats and moved like liquid mercury. He kept people at arm's length with carefully measured words and smiles that never quite reached his eyes, maintaining the kind of distance that let him navigate the shark-infested waters of high society without getting torn to pieces. He'd once loved Margaret with a passion that burned hot and clean and true, the kind of love that poets write about and most folks spend their whole lives searching for. She'd been his anchor, his compass, the one person who could see through all his carefully constructed walls to the man beneath. But cancer had taken her when Sophie was barely 2, and with her went the part of him that knew how to be gentle, how to trust, how to believe that good things could last. Little Sophie Whitmore was 7 years old with her mother's auburn curls and her father's stubborn chin. She had a closet full of toys that would have made other children weep with envy, but the only one she ever carried was a cracked china teacup. "Mama's," she'd whisper when anyone asked. She was a quiet child, too. Quiet for 7, with eyes that seemed to hold secrets too heavy for such small shoulders. Hannah had answered the newspaper ad for a housemaid, not a nanny. The Whitmore house already had a nanny, a stern woman named Miss Crawford, who kept Sophie's schedule with military precision, but seemed to regard the child as more of an inconvenience than a blessing. Hannah's job was to clean, to dust the antiques and polish the silver and make sure every surface gleamed like new money. But children have a way of finding the cracks in our carefully built walls. And Sophie found Hannah's crack. On the very first day, it was tea time. Miss Crawford insisted on proper tea time every day at 4 o'clock sharp, when Sophie first noticed the new maid with the gentle hands and sad eyes. Hannah was dusting the mantelpiece in the parlor when she heard it. A tiny voice, barely above a whisper. "You smell like Mama." Hannah turned to find Sophie standing in the doorway, clutching that cracked teacup against her chest like a lifeline. The child's eyes were wide and serious, searching Hannah's face for something she couldn't name. "Do I now?" Hannah asked, kneeling down so she was eye level with the girl. Her voice was soft, careful, the voice of someone who knew how easily hope could be crushed. Sophie nodded solemnly. "Like lavender and and sadness." Now most adults would have laughed at such a thing, or maybe felt uncomfortable with a child speaking so plainly about sadness. But Hannah just reached out and touched Sophie's cheek with fingers that trembled just slightly. "Maybe," she said, "that's because I understand sadness. And sometimes understanding something makes it smell familiar." From that day forward, Sophie began to shadow Hannah through her daily chores. She'd sit cross-legged on the floor while Hannah dusted, chattering about her dolls and her books and the dreams that visited her at night. She'd help carry the lighter cleaning supplies, her small hands eager to be useful. And every afternoon at 4 o'clock, she'd bring that cracked teacup to wherever Hannah was working and insist on having proper tea. "Pinkies up, Nanny," Sophie would say, demonstrating with exaggerated precision. She'd started calling Hannah Nanny instead of Miss Hannah, and neither Miss Crawford nor Hannah had the heart to correct her. Mama always said ladies keep their pinkies up when they drink tea. Hannah would play along, sipping imaginary tea from her own invisible cup, listening to Sophie's stories about her mother, stories that grew more elaborate and fantastical with each telling. As if the child was trying to keep her mother's memory bright through sheer force of imagination. It was during one of these tea parties that Caleb first really noticed Hannah. He'd been passing by the library on his way to his study when he heard laughter, real laughter, the kind that bubbles up from deep inside and can't be contained. He stopped, drawn by the sound like a man in the desert, drawn to water. Through the crack in the door. He saw them, his daughter and the new maid, sittin', cross-legged on the Persian rug, sharing some private joke that made Sophie's whole face light up. Hannah was laughing too, her head thrown back, and for a moment she looked young, younger than her 22 years, young enough to believe in happy endings. "What's so funny?" Caleb asked, pushing the door open wider. The laughter stopped like someone had thrown a switch. Sophie's face went carefully blank, the way it always did when her father appeared. Hannah scrambled to her feet, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice suddenly formal. We were having tea, Daddy," Sophie interrupted, but her voice was small now, uncertain. "Nanny was teaching me the proper way." Caleb's jaw tightened at the word nanny, and Hannah saw it. She saw the way his storm-gray eyes went cold, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Miss Sullivan is not your nanny, Sophie," he said, his voice carrying the kind of chill that could freeze summer flowers. "She's the maid. Miss Crawford is your nanny." Sophie's lower lip trembled, and she clutched her teacup tighter. "But Miss Crawford doesn't like tea parties. She says they're frivolous." "Perhaps," Caleb said, and Hannah heard something in his voice, something that might have been regret if she hadn't known better. "Miss Sullivan has work to do. Don't distract her from her duties." He left without another word, but not before Hannah caught something in his eyes, a flash of longing so brief she might have imagined it. That night, she lay in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters and wondered about a man who could build an empire, but couldn't seem to build a bridge to his own daughter. The first time Hannah found Sophie in her room was 3 weeks later. She'd finished her evening chores and climbed the back stairs to the 3rd floor, where the staff quarters were tucked away like an afterthought. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a dresser that had seen better decades. She was brushing out her long brown hair when she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it. A whimper. Then another. Hannah wrapped her robe around her shoulders and crept down the hall, following the sound to its source. Sophie's room was on the 2nd floor, a princess's chamber with pale pink walls and enough dolls to populate a small village. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Hannah could see a small figure huddled in the massive 4-poster bed. Sophie was crying, not the loud, demanding tears of a spoiled child, but the quiet, hopeless sobbing of someone who'd learned that crying doesn't always bring comfort. Hannah's heart clenched like a fist in her chest. "Sweetheart?" she whispered, knocking gently on the doorframe. "What's wrong?" Sophie's head shot up, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the nightlight that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Nanny?" "I had a dream again." Hannah didn't ask permission. Some things are more important than protocol. She slipped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and Sophie immediately crawled into her lap like a kitten seeking warmth. "Tell me about the dream," Hannah said, stroking the child's curls. "Mama was calling for me," Sophie whispered against Hannah's shoulder. "But I couldn't find her. I kept looking and looking, but everywhere I went, she wasn't there. And then I couldn't remember what she looked like anymore." Hannah's arms tightened around the small, trembling body. She knew about dreams like that. Dreams where the people you love slip away like smoke, where you wake up feeling more alone than when you went to sleep. "You know what I do when I have dreams like that?" Hannah asked. Sophie pulled back to look at her with eyes wide and curious. "What?" "I tell myself stories. Good stories. About people who love each other so much that not even dreams can separate them." "Want me to tell you one?" Sophie nodded eagerly, and Hannah began to spin a tale about a princess who lived in a castle made of stars, and how her mother's love was so strong it turned into a golden thread that connected them across any distance, even the distance between dreams and waking. By the time the story ended, Sophie was asleep again, curled against Hannah's side with her breathing deep and even. Hannah meant to slip away then, to return to her own bed and her own dreams. But Sophie's hand was fisted in her nightgown, and she looked so small in that big bed, so vulnerable. So Hannah eased herself down onto the floor beside the bed, using the throw pillow as a makeshift headrest. She told herself she'd just stay until Sophie was deep in sleep, until the nightmares couldn't reach her. But the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows and someone was clearing their throat above her. Hannah's eyes snapped open to find Caleb Whitmore standing beside the bed, fully dressed for the day in his customary dark suit. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were studying her with an intensity that made her skin warm. "I got that double quote," she started, scrambling to sit up. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Sophie had a nightmare, and I just ... "How long?" he asked, his voice quiet. "How long what, sir? How long has this been happening? The nightmares?" Hannah hesitated, torn between loyalty to Sophie and honesty to her employer. "A while," she admitted. "She dreams about her mother, about losing her." Something flickered across Caleb's face, pain, maybe, or guilt. He looked down at his sleeping daughter, and for a moment, his carefully controlled mask slipped. "Miss Crawford never mentioned nightmares," he said, more to himself than to Hannah. "Maybe Sophie doesn't tell Miss Crawford about them." Their eyes met across the bed, and Hannah saw a man struggling with something he couldn't name. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he was the millionaire businessman again, all sharp edges and careful distance. "This can't happen again," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's not appropriate." Hannah stood, smoothing her wrinkled clothes. "No, sir, of course not." But as she moved toward the door, Sophie stirred and opened her eyes. When she saw Hannah leaving, her face crumpled. "Don't go, Nanny," she whispered. "Please don't go." Hannah glanced back at Caleb, and for just a moment, she saw the longing in his eyes again, the same longing she'd glimpsed that day in the library. Then he turned away, and she knew the conversation was over. That night, Sophie appeared in Hannah's room again. And the night after that. Each time, Hannah would tell her stories until she fell asleep, then curl up on the narrow floor beside the bed, using her own pillow and blanket to make a makeshift nest. She told herself it was temporary, that eventually Sophie would outgrow the nightmares. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was sleeping on that hard floor because Sophie needed her. And Hannah had never been needed before. Being needed was a drug more powerful than any opium, and Hannah was addicted. The seasons turned, and Halloween came to the Whitmore estate with its usual understated elegance. Carved pumpkins that looked like works of art, decorations that whispered taste and money. Sophie had begged to be a princess for trick-or-treating, but Miss Crawford had insisted on something more educational, a suffragette, complete with a banner and serious expression. "I don't want to be a suffragette," Sophie confided to Hannah, as they worked together in the garden, harvesting the last of the late roses. "I want to be a princess like in your stories." Hannah glanced around to make sure Miss Crawford wasn't within earshot. "Tell you what," she whispered, "maybe we can make a compromise." That evening, Hannah worked by lamplight in her small room, her fingers flying as she transformed one of her own dresses, a blue one with tiny flowers that she'd bought secondhand, into something magical. She added ribbons from her sewing box, buttons she'd been saving, a sash made from an old silk scarf. When she was finished, it wasn't much by Whitmore standards, but it was made with love, and sometimes that's worth more than all the money in the world. Sophie's eyes went wide when Hannah presented the dress the next morning. "Is it really for Emmy?" "Every princess needs a proper gown," Hannah said, helping Sophie into the dress. It was too long, but they managed it with some strategic pinning, and when Sophie looked at herself in the mirror, she glowed like she'd swallowed sunshine. "I look just like the princess in your stories," she breathed. "You look better," Hannah said, and meant it. "You look like yourself." They were admiring Sophie's reflection when the door opened and Caleb walked in. He stopped short when he saw his daughter, and for a long moment, nobody said anything. "Daddy, look!" Sophie spun around, the improvised dress flaring out around her. "Nanny made me a princess dress. Isn't it beautiful?" Caleb's eyes moved from Sophie to Hannah, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Recognition. Maybe, or hunger. It's single quotes s dot 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 quotes he started, then stopped. Swallowed hard. "You look like your mother." The words hung in the air like morning mist, fragile and precious. Sophie's smile could have powered the whole estate. "Really, Daddy? Really and truly?" "Really and truly," he said, and his voice was softer than Hannah had ever heard it. That night, Sophie slept peacefully in her own bed for the first time in months. But Hannah lay awake in her narrow room, staring at the ceiling and replaying the moment when Caleb had looked at her with something that might have been gratitude, or might have been something deeper. She was still awake when she heard footsteps. In the hallway, measured, careful, the footsteps of someone trying not to wake the house. They paused outside her door, and Hannah held her breath, waiting. After what felt like forever, the footsteps continued down the hall, but she knew. Somehow, she knew they'd been his. Winter came early that year, wrapping the Whitmore estate in a blanket of snow that muffled all sound and made the world feel hushed and sacred. The kind of snow that transforms everything it touches, turning familiar landscapes into something magical and strange. Icicles hung from the eaves like crystal daggers, and the bare branches of the oak trees looked like ink sketches against the pearl gray sky. The house took on a different character in winter, warmer somehow, despite the cold that crept in around the windows and made the old floorboards creak and settle. Maybe it was the fireplaces burning in every room, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Maybe it was the way the snow softened all the sharp edges, made everything look like it belonged in a fairy tale. Or maybe it was just that. Hannah had stopped feeling like a stranger within its walls, had begun to understand its rhythms and moods, like a beloved piece of music. Sophie had settled into a new routine with the changing season. The nightmares hadn't stopped. If anything, the long winter nights seemed to make them worse, as if the darkness gave them more room to grow. But she'd learned to navigate them with Hannah's help, had developed a language of need that transcended words. They'd established a system that spoke to the deep understanding that can grow between two souls who recognize each other's pain. 1 knock meant, "I'm scared." 2 knocks meant, "Tell me a story." And 3 knocks meant, "Just sit with me until I fall asleep." It was a simple code, but it carried the weight of absolute trust, the kind that only comes when someone proves, night after night, that they'll answer when you call. Hannah had become fluent in the language of Sophie's needs, could read the slight tremor in her voice that meant the dreams were coming, could tell from the way the child held her shoulders, whether she needed comfort or distraction, or just the steady presence of someone who cared. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, this caring, like she'd been born to ease this particular child's fears and chase away these particular shadows. But it wasn't just Sophie who was changing. Hannah found herself softening around. The edges, the sharp corners of her wariness wearing smooth under the constant application of trust and affection. She'd started humming while she worked, old songs Sister Agnes had taught her, lullabies that tasted of childhood and hope. She'd begun to take pride in small things, the way sunlight looked when it hit freshly polished silver, the satisfaction of making Sophie laugh at her silly voices during story time, the quiet pleasure of knowing exactly how Caleb liked his coffee even though she'd never been asked to serve it to him. The house itself seemed to respond to her presence, as if it had been holding its breath for years and could finally exhale. Rooms that had felt cold and formal began to feel warm and lived in. The library, where she and Sophie had their tea parties, became a haven of shared stories and whispered secrets. Even the servants' quarters, usually a place of quiet desperation, began to feel like home rather than just a place to sleep. There were moments, brief, Shining moments, when Hannah caught glimpses of what this place could be if love were allowed to flourish instead of being kept locked away like expensive jewelry. Moments when Caleb would join them unexpectedly for one of their impromptu tea parties, his expensive suit wrinkled from kneeling on the floor, his laughter genuine and unguarded. Moments when Sophie would curl up between them on the library sofa, and they'd feel like a family instead of three separate people sharing the same space. It was during the first week of December that everything changed. The way things always seemed to change, not gradually like the turning of seasons, but all at once, like a door slamming shut or a glass breaking against stone. The change came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, with frost on the windows and the smell of Mrs. Peabody's biscuits drifting up from the kitchen. Hannah was in the dining room, polishing the good silver, the pieces that came out for holidays and important dinner parties, each one heavy with history and expectation. She'd learned to love this work, the way the metal warmed under her cloth, the satisfaction of seeing her reflection grow clear and bright in each surface. She was humming softly to herself one of Sophie's favorite lullabies when she heard voices drifting from the direction of Caleb's study. At first, she paid no mind. Mr. Whitmore often had business associates over, men in expensive suits who spoke in hushed tones about shipping routes and profit margins and things that existed in a world far removed from Hannah's daily concerns. But something in the tone made her pause, made her cloth grow still against the silver serving tray she was polishing. There was an urgency to the conversation, a weight that felt different from the usual business discussions. And then she heard her name, not Miss Sullivan, the formal address she was accustomed to, but Hannah, spoken in a way that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. "The necklace belonged to your wife," a stranger's voice was saying, each word dropping into the silence like stones into still water. "Pearls and sapphires, worth about $15,000. Mrs. Peabody discovered it missing from the bedroom safe during her monthly inventory." Hannah's hands began to shake so badly she had to set down the cloth before she dropped it. Margaret's necklace, she'd seen it once, briefly, when she'd been cleaning the master bedroom and Caleb had left the safe open by accident. It was a beautiful thing, the kind of jewelry that spoke of deep love and special occasions. Pearls like captured moonlight surrounding sapphires the color of midnight. "When did it go missing?" Caleb's voice was carefully controlled, but Hannah could hear the undercurrent of something dangerous beneath the calm surface. "That's difficult to determine precisely. Mrs. Peabody only noticed its absence yesterday. But it could have been gone for weeks, even months. The safe isn't opened regularly." The stranger paused, and Hannah could almost hear him choosing his words carefully. "But sir, I have to tell you, Mrs. Peabody has some concerns about the new girl." "What kind of concerns?" The ice in Caleb's voice could have frozen summer rain. "She's been observed in areas of the house where she has no business being. The family wing, specifically. Mrs. Peabody says when questioned about it, the girl claimed she was looking for your daughter, but Sophie was accounted for elsewhere at those times." Another pause, heavy with implication. "There's also the matter of her ... attachment to the child. Mrs. Peabody feels it's become inappropriate, unhealthy even." Hannah felt like she was drowning in broad daylight, like the air in the room had turned to water and she couldn't draw breath. She wanted to run, to burst into that study and defend herself, but her feet felt rooted to the polished wooden floor, her voice trapped in her throat like a bird in a cage. "Mrs. Peabody believes the Sullivan girl may have developed certain expectations regarding her position in this household," the stranger continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a diagnosis. "These charity cases, sir, they often become confused about their place, start to believe they belong somewhere they don't, and when reality sets in..." "You're suggesting she stole my wife's necklace out of spite?" Caleb's voice was deadly quiet now, the kind of quiet that came before storms. I'm suggesting she stole it because she wanted something beautiful, something that belonged to the life she thought she could have. It's a common pattern, sir. These girls from the orphanages, they grow up with nothing, and when they're suddenly surrounded by wealth, well, the temptation can be overwhelming. When did it go missing? Caleb asked. That's hard to say. Mrs. Peabody only noticed it was gone yesterday when she was doing her monthly inventory. But sir, the man's voice dropped lower. The only people with access to that safe are family and senior staff. And that new girl, the Sullivan girl, Mrs. Peabody, says she's been acting strangely lately. Strangely how? Spending time in parts of the house where she doesn't belong. Getting too familiar with your daughter, Mrs. Peabody thinks. Well, she thinks the girl might have ideas above her station. Hannah's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the silver candlestick she was holding. She wanted to run, to burst into that study and defend herself, but she was frozen, listening to her life being dissected by strangers. I find that hard to believe, Caleb said, and Hannah's heart leaped with desperate hope. Miss Sullivan has been nothing but professional. With respect, sir, these charity cases, they're not like us. They see all this wealth, and they start thinking they deserve a piece of it. Mrs. Peabody says the girl's been putting on airs, acting like she belongs here. There was a long silence, and Hannah held her breath. Search her room, Caleb said finally, and Hannah's world tilted on its axis. Tonight, after she's asleep, if you find the necklace... We'll handle it quietly, sir. No scandal. Hannah didn't wait to hear more. She set down the candlestick with trembling hands and walked from the room on legs that felt like water. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Mrs. Peabody, who was standing close enough to the study door that she'd obviously been listening to. The older woman's smile was cold as winter moonlight. Careful, dear, she said sweetly. These floors can be treacherous when they're polished too well. Hannah stood frozen in that dining room, surrounded by gleaming silver that suddenly felt like evidence of her own inadequacy, listening to her character being dissected by strangers who decided her guilt before they'd even looked for proof. Each word felt like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about herself, that she was an intruder in this world of wealth and privilege, that her love for Sophie was somehow wrong or inappropriate, that she'd been fooling herself to think she could ever truly belong. The conversation continued, but Hannah barely heard the details. Something about searching her room, about handling the matter quietly to avoid scandal, about the need to act swiftly before she could dispose of the evidence. The words washed over her like cold rain, soaking through her defenses and chilling her to the bone. When she finally managed to move, to set down the silver and walk from that room on legs that felt like water, she nearly collided with Mrs. Peabody herself. The housekeeper was standing close enough to the study door that she'd obviously been listening to, and the smile she gave Hannah was cold as winter moonlight, sharp as broken glass. Careful, dear, Mrs. Peabody said, her voice dripping with false concern. These floors can be treacherous when they're polished too well. So easy to slip, to fall, to find yourself somewhere you don't belong. Hannah understood the message and the threat behind it. This wasn't just about a missing necklace. This was about power, about territory, about keeping people in their assigned places. Mrs. Peabody had been the undisputed queen of this household for 15 years, and she wasn't about to let some orphan girl upset the carefully maintained order of things. Hannah nodded mutely and hurried away, her mind racing faster than her feet. She had to leave, had to pack her few belongings and slip out before they came for her, before they searched her room and found whatever evidence Mrs. Peabody had undoubtedly already planted there. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Cut her losses and run, the way she'd learned to do at the orphanage whenever trouble started brewing. But as she reached the stairs that led to the servants' quarters, she heard it, 3 soft knocks on wood, barely audible but unmistakable. Sophie's signal, drifting down from the second floor like a prayer. Just sit with me until I fall asleep. Hannah's steps faltered. She could slip out the back door right now, catch the evening bus into town, and be gone before morning. She could disappear into the anonymous crowds of Portland, find another job, another life, another chance to start over. It would be the sensible thing to do. But those 3 soft knocks echoed in her heart like a call to arms, like a reminder of what truly mattered in this world of shifting loyalties and hidden agendas. Whatever happened to her, whatever price she paid for staying, she couldn't abandon Sophie. Not tonight, when the child needed her. Maybe not ever. Hannah changed direction and made her way to Sophie's room, where she found the little girl sitting up in bed, her face streaked with tears that caught the light from the hallway like fallen stars. "I had the dream again," Sophie whispered, her voice small and lost in the vastness of her pink and gold bedroom. "But this time it was different. This time you were in it." Hannah's throat felt tight as she sat on the edge of the canopied bed, the mattress soft as clouds beneath her. "Tell me about it, sweetheart." "You were leaving," Sophie said, her words coming in hiccuping gasps. "You had your bag and you were walking away, and I kept calling your name, but you couldn't hear me. And then you were gone, and I was all alone again, and I couldn't remember what your voice sounded like when you told stories." The irony of it hit Hannah like a physical blow. Here was Sophie, dreaming the very thing that Hannah was contemplating. As if the child's subconscious could sense the danger that surrounded them both. "It was just a dream," Hannah said, pulling Sophie into her arms and breathing in the familiar scent of her lavender shampoo. "Just a bad dream. Promise you won't leave me?" Sophie's voice was muffled against Hannah's shoulder, but the desperation in it was clear as church bells. "Promise you'll always be here, no matter what." Hannah looked down at the child in her arms, this little girl who'd become more precious to her than her own life, who'd taught her what it meant to be needed, to be loved, to matter to someone in a way that transcended money or status or social boundaries. Sophie's eyes were wide with fear and hope, trusting and vulnerable in a way that broke Hannah's heart into 1,000 pieces. "I promise," Hannah whispered, knowing it might be the most important lie she'd ever told and the most necessary truth. "I promise I'll always love you, no matter where I am or what happens." She stayed with Sophie until the child fell into an exhausted sleep, her small hand still clutching Hannah's like a lifeline. Then she returned to her narrow room in the servants' quarters and sat on her bed, waiting for the inevitable with the kind of calm that comes when you've accepted your fate. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in like the sides of a coffin. Her few belongings, a couple of dresses, some undergarments, a small jewelry box that contained nothing more valuable than a few buttons and a hair ribbon, seemed to mock her with their meagerness. This was what her life amounted to, what she had to show for 22 years of existence. Enough possessions to fit in a single carpet bag, and a heart full of love for a child who wasn't hers to keep. Around midnight, she heard them coming. Careful footsteps in the hallway, the soft murmur of voices trying not to wake the household. The door to her room opened with barely a whisper, letting in a shaft of light from the hallway that cut through the darkness like a blade. Hannah lay still, feigning sleep, as they searched through her belongings with professional thoroughness. She could hear them moving around the small space, opening drawers, lifting the mattress, checking the pockets of her dresses. The investigator was there, along with Mrs. Peabody, their movements careful and methodical. When they found it, Margaret Whitmore's pearl and sapphire necklace, nestled in the toe of Hannah's only good shoes like a serpent in a garden, she wasn't surprised. She'd been expecting it, dreading it, but somehow it still felt like a physical blow to her chest. Well, Mrs. Peabody's voice was filled with the kind of satisfaction that comes from being proven right, even when being right means destroying someone else's life. "What have we here?" The necklace caught the light from the hallway. "It's pearls glowing like captured moonbeams, its sapphires deep as midnight seas. It was beautiful, exquisite, the kind of jewelry that spoke of deep love and special moments. And seeing it there, in her shabby shoe among her threadbare belongings, Hannah understood how damning it looked, how impossible it would be to explain. Hannah sat up slowly, meeting Mrs. Peabody's triumphant gaze with as much dignity as she could manage. Her nightgown was thin and worn, her hair loose around her shoulders, but she held herself straight as a queen facing execution. "I've never seen that necklace before in my life," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that was eating at her insides like acid. "Of course you haven't, dear," Mrs. Peabody replied, but her eyes were hard as winter stone, cold as January mornings. "Just like you've never been in the master bedroom without permission, never gone through Mrs. Whitmore's jewelry box, never entertained fantasies about what it would be like to wear such beautiful things." The accusations hung in the air like poison gas, each one designed to paint Hannah as something she wasn't: a thief, a schemer, a girl who'd let envy and greed overcome whatever decency she might have possessed. Hannah wanted to defend herself, to explain that she'd only ever been in the master bedroom to clean, that she'd never touched anything that didn't belong to her, that the very idea of stealing from this family made her sick to her stomach. But she could see in Mrs. Peabody's face that the truth didn't matter. The housekeeper had made her decision long before tonight, had probably been planning this moment since the day Hannah first arrived. This wasn't about justice or truth. It was about maintaining the natural order of things, about making sure that charity cases knew their place and stayed in it. They woke Caleb, of course, brought him up to the servants' quarters in his robe and slippers, his dark hair mussed from sleep and his eyes heavy with something that might have been sorrow or might have been disappointment. He looked older in the dim light of the hallway, more human somehow, stripped of the expensive suits and careful composure that usually armored him against the world. Hannah stood in her thin nightgown, surrounded by strangers who'd already decided. Her guilt, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than she ever had in her life. The investigator held the necklace up to the light, letting it catch the gleam from the overhead fixture, making sure everyone could see the evidence of her supposed crime. The necklace was hidden in her shoe, the investigator reported, his voice clinical and detached, as if he were discussing the weather rather than destroying a young woman's life. Concealed, but not particularly well. Almost as if she wanted it to be found. Caleb's eyes met Hannah's across the small, crowded room. In them, she saw confusion, hurt, and something that might have been hope struggling against the weight of evidence and expectation. "Did you take it?" he asked, and his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual authority and confidence. The question hung between them like a bridge that neither one wanted to cross. Hannah could have told him the truth, that she'd never even seen the necklace before tonight, that someone had planted it in her room while she was comforting his daughter, that this whole thing was a setup designed to remove her from their lives. She could have thrown herself on his mercy, begged him to believe her, reminded him of all the nights she'd spent sleeping on floors just to ease his daughter's fears. But looking at his face, she realized it wouldn't matter what she said. The evidence was there, damning, undeniable. Her word against Mrs. Peabody's, a charity case against a trusted employee of 15 years, an orphan with nothing to lose against a woman who'd helped run this household since before Sophie was born. "No," she said simply, the word falling into the silence like a stone into deep water. "I didn't take it." Something flickered in Caleb's eyes, doubt, maybe, or hope fighting against the inevitable. For just a moment, Hannah thought she saw the man she'd glimpsed in unguarded moments, the father who'd laughed at Sophie's tea parties, the widower who still grieved for his lost wife. But then Mrs. Peabody stepped forward, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "Sir, if I may," she said, her voice dripping with false regret and carefully manufactured concern. "I feel I must tell you, earlier today, I observed Miss Sullivan coming out of the family wing of the house." When I questioned her about her presence there, she claimed she was looking for Sophie, but I had just seen your daughter in the nursery with Miss Crawford not 5 minutes before. It was a lie, as blatant and calculated as everything else about this night. Hannah had been looking for Sophie, had found the child hiding in her mother's old sitting room, crying over a photograph she discovered in a drawer. But Mrs. Peabody's version sounded more plausible, more damning, painting Hannah as someone who'd been casing the family quarters, planning her theft. Hannah didn't bother defending herself. What was the point? They'd made up their minds before they'd even searched her room, had probably decided her fate the moment Mrs. Peabody realized that Sophie's affection for the young maid posed a threat to the established order of things. "Pack your things," Caleb said, his voice carefully neutral. "Be gone by morning." Hannah nodded, accepting the inevitable. But as the little group filed out of her room, she caught Caleb's arm. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't. Tell Sophie I'm a thief. Tell her. Tell her I had to go help someone else. Tell her anything, but don't let her think." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. "Why? Does it matter what she thinks?" "Because she loves me," Hannah said simply. "And children shouldn't have to learn that the people they love can disappoint them. Not yet." She saw him flinch, saw the words hit home. Then he was gone, and Hannah was alone with her shame and her broken heart. She packed her few belongings by lamplight, moving quietly so as not to wake anyone. At the bottom of her carpet bag, she found the little teddy bear Sophie had given her for her birthday, a shabby thing with mismatched button eyes that Sophie had loved until its fur was worn thin. "He's lonely," Sophie had explained when she'd pressed the bear into Hannah's hands. "He needs someone to love him." Hannah mended the bear's torn seam with careful stitches, then placed it on Sophie's pillow where she'd find it in the morning. Maybe it would help, knowing that Hannah had left her something to remember her by. As she prepared to slip out of the house, Hannah wrote a letter, the letter she'd never send, because there was no point in sending letters to people who thought you were a thief. But she needed to write it, needed to put her feelings somewhere before they ate her alive. "My dearest Sophie, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Your father thinks I took something that didn't belong to me, and maybe he's right. Maybe I did take something, your trust, your love, your faith in me. Those weren't mine to keep, but I kept them anyway, held them close like treasures. I want you to know that every story I told you was true. There really is magic in the world, and it lives in the way you laugh and the way you care for that old teddy bear and the way you make tea parties feel like royal ceremonies. You are the princess in every story I ever told, and someday you'll find your happy ending. Tell your father I love you forever. Even if no one ever loved me. Your Nanny." Hannah. She sealed the letter and tucked it under her mattress where it would probably stay until someone else cleaned out the room. Then she shouldered her bag and walked out into the December night, leaving behind the only home she'd ever truly known. The bus station was nearly empty at that hour, just a few night shift workers and insomniacs waiting for connections to somewhere else. Hannah bought a ticket to Portland with the last of her savings and settled onto a hard plastic seat to wait for the 6 a.m. bus. She dozed fitfully, jerked awake by the sound of every car that pulled into the parking lot. Part of her, the foolish, hopeful part, kept expecting to see Caleb's black sedan, kept imagining him coming to tell her it had all been a mistake, that he believed her, that he wanted her to come home. But morning came gray and cold, and the only person who came for her was the bus driver. Sophie woke up screaming. It was barely dawn when her cries echoed through the house, raw and desperate and full of a grief too large for such a small body. Caleb ran to her room in his robe and bare feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found her sitting up in bed, clutching the mended teddy bear to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "She's gone," Sophie sobbed. "Nanny's gone, and she left Mr. Bear behind because she doesn't want to remember me." Caleb gathered his daughter into his arms, feeling helpless and furious and heartbroken all at once. He murmured against her hair. "It's all right. Miss Crawford is here, and Mrs. Peabody, and I don't want Miss Crawford." Sophie's voice cracked with the force of her crying. "I want my nanny. I want Hannah." The use of Hannah's first name hit Caleb like a physical blow. When had his formal daughter started thinking of the maid by her given name? When had she started loving her so fiercely that her absence could cause this kind of pain? "Sophie, listen to me," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Miss Sullivan had to leave. She took something that didn't belong to her." Sophie pulled back to look at him with eyes swollen from crying. "That's not true. Hannah wouldn't steal. She wouldn't. Sweetheart, she wouldn't." Sophie's voice rose to a shriek that made Caleb's ears ring. "She's good and kind, and she tells stories and makes tea parties, and she sleeps on the floor so I won't be alone. She wouldn't steal anything." Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What did you say? About sleeping on the floor?" Sophie hiccuped, wiping her nose on her nightgown sleeve. "When I have bad dreams, she comes and sleeps on my floor so I won't be scared. She uses a pillow and everything, and in the morning she's always there." The pieces began to fall into place. All those mornings he'd found Hannah looking tired. The way she'd sometimes wince when she stood up, as if her back ached. She'd been sleeping on hard floors for months, just to comfort his daughter. "Daddy," Sophie whispered, her voice small and broken. "Please bring her back. Please?" Caleb held his daughter as she cried, and for the first time since Margaret's death, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The days that followed were a special kind of hell, the kind that burns slow and leaves scars that never fully heal. Sophie refused to eat anything more than a few bites at meals, pushing food around her plate like she was trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. She barely spoke, answering questions with nods or shakes of her head, her usual bright chatter replaced by a silence that seemed to echo through the halls of the great house. Miss Crawford reported that the child was having what she delicately termed behavioral issues, hiding in closets and under beds, throwing tantrums when asked to do simple tasks, asking constantly when Hannah was coming back as if the question itself could somehow change the answer. She'd stopped playing with her toys, stopped asking for stories, stopped being the curious, engaged child she'd been just days before. At night, her screams would wake the entire household. Not the quiet whimpers that had brought Hannah to her room in the past, but full-throated cries of anguish that seemed to tear through the walls themselves. She'd wake up sobbing, calling for her nanny, begging for someone to tell her stories about princesses and happy endings. When Miss Crawford or one of the other servants would try to comfort her, she'd curl into herself like a wounded animal, inconsolable in her grief. Mrs. Peabody, now triumphant in her victory over the young maid who dared to upset the natural order of things, suggested hiring a replacement immediately. "Children are resilient, sir," she told Caleb with the kind of confidence that came from years of managing other people's lives. "Miss Sophie will forget about the Sullivan girls soon enough. What she needs is structure, discipline, a return to proper routine." But Sophie didn't forget. If anything, her grief seemed to deepen with each passing day, like a wound that refused to heal, that festered and spread until it poisoned everything around it. She stopped laughing altogether, stopped asking questions about the world around her, stopped doing all the small things that had made her such a bright, curious child. It was like watching a flower wilt in slow motion, like seeing the light go out of someone's eyes one flicker at a time. Caleb found himself standing outside his daughter's room at night, listening to her cry, feeling more helpless than he ever had in his life. He was a man who could move mountains when he put his mind to it, who could solve problems with phone calls and checkbooks and the sheer force of his will. But he couldn't solve this. He couldn't bring back the light in his daughter's eyes, couldn't make her smile again, couldn't undo the damage that had been done to both their hearts. On the fourth night, when Sophie's sobs had finally quieted to exhausted hiccups, Caleb found himself standing in Hannah's old room. Mrs. Peabody had had it cleaned out immediately. All traces of its former occupant scrubbed it away as if Hannah Sullivan had never existed at all. The walls had been repainted, the floors polished until they gleamed, the narrow bed stripped down to its bare mattress. But something made Caleb lift that mattress, some instinct or intuition or desperate hope. And there, pressed flat against the bed frame where it had been overlooked in the haste to erase all evidence of Hannah's presence, he found it, the letter she had never sent. His hands shook as he unfolded the worn piece of paper, as he read the words that had been meant for his daughter's eyes but had never reached their destination. Each sentence hit him like a physical blow, each word a knife twisted in his chest. My dearest Sophie, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Disappeared into the world like smoke on the wind, like all the other invisible people who move through the lives of the wealthy without leaving any lasting mark. Your father believes I took something that didn't belong to me, and maybe he's right. Maybe I did take something, your trust, your love, your faith in me. Those weren't mine to keep, treasures that a girl like me had no right to hold. But I kept them anyway, held them close like precious stones. I want you to know that every story I told you was true, even if I'm not the person you thought I was. There really is magic in this world, sweetheart, and it lives in places you might never expect to find it. It lives in the way you laugh when something truly delights you, bright and pure as silver bells. It lives in the way you care for that old teddy bear, loving him not despite his worn places but because of them. It lives in the way you make tea parties feel like royal ceremonies, as if we were dining with kings and queens instead of sitting on a library floor with cracked cups and invisible treats. You are the princess in every story I ever told, the Feilende, hero of every adventure, the light that chases away every shadow. Someday, when you're older and the pain of this doesn't cut quite so deep, you'll find your own happy ending. I know this as surely as I know my own name, because you have the kind of heart that makes its own magic, that turns ordinary moments into fairy tales. Tell your father that I forgive him for not believing me, because I understand why he couldn't. Trust is a luxury that men like him can't afford to give freely, especially to girls like me. But tell him also that I'll love you forever and always, no matter where I am or what becomes of me. Even if no one in this world ever loved me back, your nanny Hannah P.S. I've mended Mr. Bear's torn seam. Take care of him for me, and remember that broken things can still be beautiful, still be worthy of love. The letter slipped from Caleb's fingers and fluttered to the floor like a fallen leaf. He sank onto the narrow bed where Hannah had slept, where she'd dreamed of belonging to their little family, and put his head in his hands. Even if no one in this world ever loved me back, the words echoed in his mind like an accusation, like a condemnation of everything he'd become since Margaret's death. He'd been so afraid of being hurt again, so terrified of letting anyone else into the fortress of his heart, that he'd become the kind of man who could destroy an innocent woman's life rather than risk believing in her goodness. What had he done? What terrible, irreversible thing had he done? That evening, he called the private investigator who'd found the necklace back to the house. Tell me exactly how you found it, he said. The man looked uncomfortable. Sir, I told you. It was hidden in her shoe. Tell me again, every detail. As the investigator recounted the search, Caleb listened with new ears. The necklace had been too perfectly placed, so obviously hidden, and Mrs. Peabody had been very insistent that they search Hannah's room first, before any of the other staff. Quarters. Check the pawn shops, Caleb said suddenly. Sir? Check the local pawn shops. See if any Whitmore jewelry has been sold in the past few months. Quietly. The investigator nodded, but his expression was puzzled. Sir, we already found the necklace. The case is closed. The case, Caleb said quietly, is just beginning. It took 3 days to find what he was looking for. Mrs. Peabody had been careful, but not careful enough. Over the past 6 months, she'd sold several small items: a silver letter opener, a pair of crystal candlesticks, a jewelry box that had belonged to Margaret. Small things that wouldn't be missed immediately, sold to different pawn shops across the city. When confronted with the evidence, Mrs. Peabody's composure cracked like ice on a warm day. "You don't understand," she said, her voice sharp with desperation. "I've given 15 years of my life to this house." 15 years, and for what? To watch you lavish attention on some charity case while your own staff struggles to make ends meet? "So you decided to steal from me," Caleb said, his voice deadly. "Quiet. I took what I was owed. And when that girl started getting ideas above her station, when I saw you looking at her like you used to look at your wife, I knew she had to go." The admission hung in the air between them like poison gas. Caleb felt sick physically. Sick at the realization of what he'd done. "You planted the necklace." Mrs. Peabody lifted her chin defiantly. "I protected this family. That girl was nothing but trouble, getting your daughter attached to her, making Sophie think she could be a replacement mother. Get out." Caleb's voice was barely controlled, vibrating with a rage that made the air itself seem to tremble. "Get out of my house, now, before I do something we'll both regret." Mrs. Peabody opened her mouth to speak, but something in Caleb's eyes stopped her. She gathered what remained of her dignity and walked from the room, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the sudden silence. Caleb stood alone in his study, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. He'd destroyed an innocent woman's life, broken his daughter's heart, and for what? Pride? Fear? The terrible certainty that he couldn't afford to trust anyone ever again. He thought of Hannah's letter, of the words that had burned themselves into his memory, "Even if no one ever loved me." How wrong she'd been. Sophie loved her with the pure, uncomplicated devotion that children reserve for the people who truly see them. And God help him, he'd been falling in love. With her too. Had been fighting it every day, terrified of what it might mean to let someone else into the carefully guarded fortress of his heart. So when the accusations came, when the evidence seemed so damning, part of him had been almost relieved. Here was proof that he'd been right to keep his distance, right to trust no one. But he'd been wrong. So terribly, catastrophically wrong. The question now was whether he could make it right. Hannah had been in Portland for 2 weeks when she found the booth space at Saturday Market. It wasn't much, a 6-foot table squeezed between a pottery vendor and someone selling hand-knitted scarves, but it was hers, and it was a start. She'd spent her savings on fabric and thread, needles and buttons, all the materials she'd need to build something from nothing. Her fingers remembered the lessons Sister Agnes had taught her all those years ago, how to make a few scraps of cloth into something beautiful, how to stitch love into every seam. The dolls she made weren't fancy. They had mismatched button eyes, and hair made from yarn, clothes sewn from remnants and imagination. But each one was made with care, with the kind of attention that could only come from someone who understood what it meant to be unwanted. Thread and Grace, she called her little enterprise, after the motto Sister Agnes used to embroider on samplers: "By thread and grace, all things can be mended." The first Saturday was cold and gray, with a wind that cut through Hannah's thin coat and made her fingers stiff and clumsy. She sold 3 dolls, enough to buy groceries for the week and pay for another booth space. The second Saturday was better, and the third better still. People began to notice her work, to ask for custom orders. A doll that looked like a lost daughter, a teddy bear to replace one that had been loved beyond repair. Each request was a small wound and a small healing, reminding Hannah of the family she'd lost and the purpose she'd found. She was arranging her display on a sunny December morning when she felt eyes on her. She looked up, expecting to see a potential customer, and nearly dropped the doll she was holding. Caleb Whitmore stood at the edge of her booth, wearing jeans and a wool coat instead of his usual expensive suit. He looked older somehow, worn down by something heavier than time. Behind him, barely visible, stood Sophie. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Sophie broke free from her father's side and launched herself at Hannah with a cry that cut through the market noise like a blade. "Nanny, you came back. I knew you'd come back." Hannah caught the child in her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and the lingering sweetness of childhood. Sophie felt thinner than she remembered, more fragile, and when she pulled back to look at her, Hannah saw shadows under the girl's eyes that hadn't been there before. "Oh, sweetheart," Hannah whispered, cupping Sophie's face in her hands. "Look how you've grown." "I missed you so much," Sophie said, and her voice cracked with the weight of it. "I missed you every day and every night and in between." Hannah's eyes met Caleb's over Sophie's head, and she saw her own pain reflected there. He looked like a man who'd been carrying the world on his shoulders and had finally realized he didn't have to bear it alone. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice carefully formal. "Hannah, I owe you an apology." Hannah stood slowly, one hand still resting on Sophie's shoulder. Around them, the market continued its cheerful chaos, but their little corner felt suspended. "In time," Mrs. Peabody confessed, Caleb continued. "She'd been stealing from us for months. She planted the necklace in your room because ... He swallowed hard. "Because she was afraid I was getting too attached to you, and she was right." The admission hung between them like morning mist. Hannah felt her heart skip, then race, then seemed to stop altogether. "Daddy fired her," Sophie said, pressing closer to Hannah's side, "and he's been looking for you ever since. We went to 27 craft fairs before we found you." 29. Caleb corrected quietly, never taking his eyes off Hannah's face. "I would have searched 100 more." Hannah felt tears prick at her eyes. "You believed her. When it came down to it, you believed Mrs. Peabody over me." "Yes," Caleb said simply. "And that was the worst mistake I've ever made. Worse than the business deals I've botched, worse than the risks I didn't take. I let fear make me stupid, and I hurt the two people who matter most to me." The confession was raw, honest, stripped of the careful language he usually used to keep the world at arm's length. Hannah saw the man behind the millionaire, the father behind the businessman, and her heart began to thaw despite her best efforts to keep it frozen. "Can you forgive me?" he asked before Hannah could answer. Sophie tugged on her sleeve. "Nanny, look what I brought you." She reached into her small backpack and pulled out something that made Hannah's breath catch, her old teddy bear, the one she'd mended and left on Sophie's pillow. "You forgot Mr. Bear," Sophie said solemnly, "but I kept him safe for you. I told him stories every night, just like you used to tell me." Hannah took the bear with trembling hands, feeling the familiar softness of his worn fur, the tiny stitches she'd made to repair his torn seam. It was such a small thing, but it represented everything she'd lost and found again. "Sophie," she said carefully, "why did your father really come looking for me?" Sophie glanced at her father, then back at Hannah, her expression serious beyond her years. "Because he loves you. And because I told him that if he didn't find you and bring you home, I was going to run away and find you myself." "Sophie," Caleb said, but there was more affection than reproach in his voice. "It's true, Daddy, and you said you loved her too when you thought I was sleeping." Caleb's face went red, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at Hannah with eyes that held no pretense, no careful distance. "She's right," he said quietly. "I do love you. I've loved you since the day I found you sleeping on Sophie's floor, putting her needs before your own comfort. I loved you when you made that dress from scraps and turned my daughter into the princess she'd always been inside. I loved you when you mended her teddy bear instead of just throwing it away." He stepped closer, close enough that Hannah could smell his cologne, and see the silver threading through his dark hair. I loved you, and it terrified me. So when Mrs. Peabody gave me an excuse to push you away, I took it, like a coward. Hannah felt her carefully built walls crumbling. Caleb ... I know I don't deserve forgiveness, he said quickly. I know I hurt you in ways that can't be undone. But if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you, both of you. Hannah looked down at Sophie, who was watching this exchange with the intense focus of a child whose happiness hung in the balance. She thought of all the nights she'd spent on hard floors, all the stories she'd told, all the love she'd poured into a family that wasn't hers. But maybe it could be. Maybe it was meant to be all along. I forgive you, she said finally, and watched relief flood Caleb's face like sunrise. But I have conditions, anything. No more keeping people at arm's length, no more walls. If we're going to be a family, we're going to be a real one. Done. And no more sleeping on floors. If Sophie has nightmares, we all deal with them together. Absolutely. And ... Hannah's voice grew softer. No more secrets. If you're scared, tell me. If I'm scared, I'll tell you. We face things together. Caleb reached out and took her free hand, the one that wasn't holding the teddy bear. His fingers were warm and slightly calloused, real in a way that made her heart race. Together, he agreed. Sophie looked back and forth between them, then grinned, with the pure joy that only children can manage. Does this mean Hannah's going to be my real mama now? Hannah and Caleb exchanged a look over her head, a look full of possibility and promise, and the kind of love that grows slowly, carefully, built on foundation of trust earned and freely given. We'll see, sweetheart, Hannah said. But I'm not going anywhere, not ever again, promise. Hannah knelt down so she was eye level with Sophie, the way she had that very first day when a lonely little girl had told her she smelled like sadness. And lavender, I promise. Cross my heart and hope to fly. Sophie giggled at their old joke. Hearts don't fly, Nanny. Mine does, Hannah said, and meant it. Yours does too. As they packed up Hannah's booth, her dolls and her dreams and her carefully rebuilt life, Caleb bought every single item she had on display. For the children will help, he said when she protested. There are a lot of little girls out there who need to know they're not invisible. Hannah looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just the millionaire businessman, but the man who'd learned that money could buy a lot of things. But love wasn't one of them. Love had to be earned, one story at a time, one sleepless night at a time, one mended teddy bear at a time. The wedding took place 6 months later in the garden where the Whitmore roses bloomed scarlet and sweet. It wasn't a grand affair, just family and close friends. Sophie in a dress she'd helped design, Hannah in a gown that had belonged to Caleb's grandmother. But the most important moment wasn't the exchange of vows, or the kiss that sealed their promise. It was when Sophie, serving as their flower girl, placed her mother's cracked teacup beside Hannah's bouquet. For Mama, she said simply, so she knows it's okay. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Caleb whispered in Hannah's ear, "Why did you sleep on the floor?" Really? Hannah smiled against his shoulder, remembering another version of herself, a girl who'd believed she was invisible, who'd never been chosen, who'd thought love was something that happened to other people. So she'd never wake up alone, she said, like I did. But those days were behind them now. Behind all of them, 5 years later, Grace House opened its doors on the outskirts of Portland. It was a home for girls who'd aged out of the system. Girls who'd been told they were too old, too difficult, too damaged to deserve love. Hannah ran it with the same fierce devotion she'd once brought to caring for Sophie, while Caleb provided the funding and the business expertise to keep it running. Sophie, now 12 and wise beyond her years, spent her weekends at Grace House, teaching the newer residents how to have proper tea parties, how to hold their pinkies just so, How to believe in happy endings even when the world seemed determined to prove them wrong. Remember, she'd tell them, echoing words Hannah had once told her, every princess needs a proper gown. But first, she needs to know she's already a princess inside. On quiet evenings, when the house was settled and the girls were safe in their beds, Hannah would walk through the halls and remember another house, another lifetime. She'd think of Mrs. Peabody, who'd spent her final years in a small apartment, alone with her bitterness and her regrets. She'd think of all the children who went to sleep afraid, all the people who believed themselves unlovable, all the hearts that had never learned to fly. But mostly, she'd think of the miracle that had brought her here, the way love could bloom. In the most unlikely places, the way families could be built from choice rather than blood. The way sleeping on a hard floor could lead to dreams beyond imagining. Caleb would find her there sometimes, standing in the hallway with that distant look in her eyes. He'd wrap his arms around her from behind and whisper, "What are you thinking about?" And Hannah would lean back against his chest and smile, breathing in the scent of home, not the lavender and sadness Sophie had once identified, but something richer, warmer, something that smelled like belonging. "I'm thinking," she'd say, "about how sometimes the best things come from the worst moments. How sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you were really looking for." And what were you looking? Awful? Hannah would turn in his arms then, looking at the man who'd taught her that love didn't make you weak. It made you brave enough to sleep on floors, to fight for what mattered, to believe in second chances. "A family," she'd say. "I was looking for a family." And then they'd go home together, to the house where their daughter waited with stories to tell and tea to share, where love lived in every corner and every shadow held the promise of morning. Wind. Through autumn leaves, children's laughter fading to silence. "You see, I told you it was a story worth telling. About a man who had everything and a girl who had nothing. And how they learned that love isn't about what you can buy or what you can give. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice, what floors you're willing to sleep on, what hearts you're willing to mend." Hannah Sullivan, Hannah Whitmore now, she learned that being invisible wasn't a curse. Sometimes it was a gift, because it meant you could see the other invisible people, the ones who needed someone to notice them, to choose them, to sleep on their floors when the nightmares came calling. And Caleb? Well, he learned that walls might keep out the cold, but they also keep out the light. Sometimes you gotta tear down what you built to make room for what you need. That little teacup Sophie carried. It sits on the mantelpiece at Grace House now, a reminder that broken things can still hold beauty, that cracks don't make you worthless, they make you real. So the next time you see someone sleeping rough, someone who looks invisible, someone the world's forgotten, remember Hannah's story. Remember that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear threadbare dresses and carry mended teddy bears, and know that love isn't about grand gestures. It's about who stays when the floors all you got to offer. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to change everything.